Welcome everyone to PTZoptics and HuddleCam HD presents Tech Town Hall with yours truly, William Goldie, your host of the Tech Town Halls to discuss various topics in Pro AV broadcast and live streaming. Now, this week we are again joined by our product evangelists, the brains of the operation, Stephen and Matt, who will help us walk through today's topic. Now, we've been talking recently a lot about NDI products, various different workflows that we can use over IP. So we thought it prudent to go ahead and demystify IP infrastructure networking in general, talk to some specific frequently asked questions and general concerns that people have in the industry with IP infrastructure. So without further ado, I'm going to toss it over to them to go ahead and talk us through today's topic. Gentlemen, how are we doing today?
Doing well.
Yeah, doing great.
All right.
Excited to cover this topic here today.
Yeah, it's definitely one that keeps coming up with a lot of our salespeople, myself included. So yeah, we'll hop into it with you guys right now. Take it away.
So, Matt, this is something that I know for myself, and I'm sure other people that are watching this right now uh, always think that they know enough to be dangerous, and then that dangerous part usually nips them in the bud later on when new technology comes out. So,
Yeah, and I'll even admit, no matter how much you learn about networking, you're always living in that danger zone in the sense of you always know just enough to be dangerous, no matter how much you learn about this. The beauty is you can pretty much always fix any problem you can create, so shouldn't really be afraid of it.
so let's kind of dive into this because what are the types of devices that make up a network? Because a lot of people, they hear network and they get all freaked out and they think that, oh man, this is above my pay grade. But you know, you really shouldn't be scared of that, right? I mean, there's some simple components with this.
Yeah. No, networks are not really something to be afraid of like they were back in the long time ago days. You don't need to be a super duper expert to get one set up in modern day. We've got all these beautiful interfaces that look like web pages that make a majority of getting a network set up very easy. Um, to that end, we could start to explore what those components are and kind of how they feed into each other. Um, we could start with just looking at probably the simplest concept of a network, which would be, and excuse me if I'm going to use a little bit of terminology here, but an unmanaged or also known as a dumb switch. You can create a network using just a little box with a lot of little ports on it where you're connecting everything together. The difference is there, you might need to do a little bit of manual setup. But again, you can do it with literally a box. You could go to Best Buy today. You can pick up one of these network switches and create your own little network to start having devices talk to each other and control them. Now, that being said, I just used the term unmanaged switch. And what an unmanaged switch means is it's a switch where you don't really get much control over it. You don't really get to tell it what to do, how to behave, how to talk to other switches, other devices. It's really there just to share information between devices in a often unintelligent way, as you can't really prioritize anything. So, I use the term unmanaged switch, and it looks like Stephen actually has an excellent example of one of these lined up. Um, so, here is a perfect example of an unmanaged switch. No real serial port, no web interface to it. It is literally you plug devices in and you go to town. Um, Obviously, if you have a unmanaged switch, there must be this other thing that's a managed switch. So where the difference comes in there is if you want to do a larger deployment or you want a lot more granular control over how your information is flowing, you're going to want to explore something called a managed switch. And whether that is where you have a larger controller that controls that switch, whether it is directly handled on the switch itself, you have the ability to control the type of content and how it's treated on that switch. So as an example, we keep talking NDI. On a managed switch, you could give priority to NDI traffic over, say, Joe, who's also in the same building and is deciding to surf the internet. That way it does not impact your performance. So, you can always start out with an unmanaged dumb switch. But as your needs grow, that's where you're going to find value in exploring having a managed network solution.
So,
Now, yeah,
well,
go for it.
oh, I was going to ask you here, with these switches, okay? So obviously we have to have something before the switch, right? I mean, we have we have the router.
Yeah, so you can get away without a router,
Okay.
but you are living in a danger zone in the sense that if your production gets complex, it could fall to pieces very quickly. So that's where you would want to explore something like Steven just mentioned, a router. And what a router is going to offer you is a little intelligence. So the router can talk to dumb switches. If you have a managed switch, you're going to want to find a router from that same manufacturer. Um, so what the router is really going to do, it allows two different networks to talk to each other. Whether that is two of your own networks, whether it is one of your network talking to the public internet, it's really translating information between two networks. That's its main job. Beyond that, that's where you can have things like DHCP servers built in. I'm not going to go through the acronym because it's not going to have meaning, but what it ultimately means is it automatically assigns IP addresses. So you don't need to figure this stuff out on your own. You don't need to be doing this on the fly or creating a giant map. It's automatically going to assign things for you.
Well,
Yeah.
well, what I was going to ask was, okay, so here I am. I'm a user. I'm on Amazon right now, and I just typed in network switch.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's different ports. There's different options for, like you said, acronyms of like PPOE, PPOE plus. Like, I'm starting to wig out now. What do I got to do here?
Yeah, so we touched on the whole concept of a managed and an unmanaged switch, and that as you grow, you'd want to look at managed. If you're just a simple setup and not really planning to grow, an unmanaged switch might do what you need. But Steven's got a good point here. These switches come with other features, whether they are managed or unmanaged. So one of those features you're going to want to be aware of is the speed ratings that it has. So you will see network switches that have a rating of 10, 100. You also see switches that have a rating of 10, 100, 1000, 10, 100, 1000, 10,000, and they keep going up. What that is relating to is how fast the switch can operate. Now, just because you see it advertised as a 1 gig switch or a 10, 100, 1000 does not mean if you buy a really, really inexpensive switch that every port is going to be capable of that. So one of the other things to be aware of is there's often something noted in the specs about a backplane. The backplane of any switch is its total data capacity. So you could have 8 ports that are all gig ports, but you can only handle 2.5 gigs on the switch. So when you think you found a super great deal on a switch, just make sure to do a little bit of homework to make sure that you are getting what you need to do your job. And in that sense, I really wouldn't recommend anyone look at anything under a 1 gig switch, a 10, 100, 1000. Even if you're using, like our NDI HX products that are super high efficiency, you're still really only going to get 7 or 8 at best of these on the network before it starts to have problems. And opportunity to note this, if you're designing a brand new system, the rule of thumb, leave yourself 60% headroom. I know it sounds insane, but if you're going to need 2 gig capabilities, well, you should be oversizing that to accommodate 60% extra headroom. Now, there's one other acronym that I think is going to be important for us to discuss here. Uh, PoE.
Mm.
So PoE is a super awesome feature where it allows a switch to send power to the devices connected to it. PoE is the original, standard. It handles a lower wattage than you'll find on the other things I'm going to mention here. And the thing to note here is that the PTZoptics products all support PoE. They do not require what I am about to mention, which is PoE Plus. So PoE Plus adds additional headroom so you can power more devices that are power hungry. And then we also now have PoE Plus Plus. And before you ask, yes, I do believe they are also working on PoE Plus 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 at this point. So by the time you reach PoE Plus Plus, you're reaching the point where you can power TVs, computers, lights, all sorts of very interesting devices, and it's all with your network switch. So when planning it out, just make sure you know what you're connecting to the switch. And if you need PoE Plus Plus, well, don't go and buy a PoE Plus switch. It is not going to power your devices properly and cause you nothing but heartache.
So getting something like this is easier in the long run because now I only have to run an Ethernet cable to my cameras. I don't have to run power. I don't have to run any of that stuff. So essentially, guys doing video really should look into PoE switches for their network.
Yes. Yeah. And often I'll say, at the grade they should be looking at, they're probably going to see PoE Plus on most of those switches this day and age. Um, again, this is reaching for what everybody loves when they hear, which is one cable going to your camera. And you're going to find this for a lot more devices outside of just the cameras. But the idea that one cable can handle your video, your audio, your control, and your power, well, it starts to clean up a lot of things and lead to a lot less to worry about.
Well, let's get into a little bit of what's a gateway in network? Like how do IP networks basically work? How do they function?
Yeah. So I'm going to use an analogy. I'm going to use the mail system. The United States Postal Service is a very easy way to try and describe how these things operate. So early on, you might have heard me mention that devices get something called an IP address. So when something is on a network, it is using an IP address to identify itself. That IP address, for lack of a better term, is like your home address. Okay. So it's how people know how to get to you. And especially, they might be a little bit more familiar if they live in your town, which would be the same idea as living within your network. So they know how to easily reach you. It's no big deal. But if you were to go across the country, well, people might not really know your town and it's a little bit more of a mystery. So you might need extra devices in the middle to help guide that mail. So what goes on here? And I'm gonna try and relate this to using like a browser at the moment. If you open a browser and you go to Google and you do a search, well, you're sending that search out to Google's servers, and magically an answer comes back to you. It's pretty amazing. I know it seems simple, but it really is pretty amazing. That data goes out to who knows where and comes all the way back to you. So the way it's doing this is it's the same as if you had a letter, and you're sending it from your home, and you put it in the mailbox, and it's got your return address on it and the place it's going. Well, where this differs a little bit from the mail system is imagine now when it got to your local sorting facility, that sorting facility now put your envelope inside an envelope of their own that had where it was going to and then had a return address, which was their address. So this keeps getting passed all the way along until it hits its destination. When it gets to the destination, they can literally open all those envelopes and know exactly how to send that information all the way back to you. So whether you're dealing with a local network, whether you're dealing with the public internet, it all operates the same where that information tells the destination how to get the information back to you by including these little bits of information along the way.
So, with that being said, can two devices have the same IP address by chance, or is that because this is detrimental when it comes to video? How would you
Um,
select it? What happens?
I would say unless you are trying to do some very, very crazy things on a network, it is far from ideal to ever have two devices with the same IP address. It will lead to something called an IP conflict. Um, if you are very, very good with networking, you might be able to have multiple devices with the same IP and they're talking slightly different, so it's not of concern. That being said, that is not a good networking practice. You should try and make sure every device that is on your network has a unique IP address, either assigned to it, or the assigned in the sense that it is automatically assigned, or that you have physically told it this is going to be its IP address. Something that we would call a static IP or a static address at that point.
So before we kick it back over to Will, because I know he's got some questions here, um, can you just take, say, a PTZoptics camera and just plug it into a switch and into the computer and it just work, or is there some kind of configuration that has to be done? Same way with the joysticks. I mean, is that something that uh, somebody that can just open it up out of the box, be non-technical, and make this work using our built-in NDI?
Yeah. So I would say you're currently actually gonna be witnessing a change to the PTZoptics products and how they talk to your network. Um, Before we were kind of adhering to a little bit more of Pro AV and giving devices static IPs. So it used to take a little bit of work, whether it was using the IR remote or a tool to give it, a different address. But you're going to find that more and more PTZoptics products are coming with DHCP enabled, which means if your network has a DHCP server, it is automatically going to give an address to that device and you don't need to do anything. Um, so at the moment, if you have one of our products, it may require a little bit of setup to either tell it to use DHCP. Again, IR remotes can make that happen. Yay. Um, but you're going to be finding that we are going to be adhering to standard networking practices, which means you plug it in, you have a DHCP server on your network, which most routers have. It's just going to start working.
So the big question I have, and I'm sure a lot of these guys have, is what is the proper way to set up a network? I know when I first came on board here, again, I'm one of those guys that know enough about networking to be dangerous. I am not a network guru, but I had created a network here in my studio slash game room where I came out of my modem, went into my router, came out of that into a switch, and I just continued to daisy chain switches. And I think you were laughing because I said I had like 15 switches. You understood why I did it, is compartmentizing, so I
Yeah,
knew if something
yes. Yep.
went wrong. But
The
you're going to
Pro AV guy
demonstrate
in
for
me
us.
totally resonated with you. Totally resonated with you there. It was like, I get it. I totally understand why this seems like the right thing. So I'm going to try and do a little drawing here of what we're talking about to help a little bit. But so what Steven's describing, he had originally done. He had a modem that fed into a router. And then what he did, and this makes sense, and I'll show you why here in a moment, he had a switch. And I'm sure it did everything he needed with that first switch originally. But all of a sudden, you get more devices, and we all are. We're all getting more and more IP connected devices in our lives, for better or worse. I think the better is it makes life a little easier. So, what you run out of ports, what do? Okay, cool. I'm just gonna add another switch here. And you run out of ports there. Oh, okay, no big deal. I'll just add another switch. And you can keep doing this. And where the problem starts to come in, if you have a device that is over here, we'll see if I can draw a little camera there. Woo, little camera. Sorry for the ugly nature of this. And I have another little camera over here. Well, one of the problems starts to become for these things to talk in any way, or I guess really a joystick controller might be better, or a PC, well, the information now has to jump between all of these switches to share its information, let alone if that needs to get out to the public world, it's got a lot further it needs to go. So rather than doing it like that, what I talked about with Steven was ultimately, I'll let my little drawing here catch up, but we would wind up, oh, almost there.
Google's
Come
not
on.
cooperating with us today.
No, it's not. But I'll use this as a little opportunity to talk about network hops. So I'm drawing these lines, and ultimately it's how many jumps a device has to take to go from switch to another PC, to another switch, to a router, to a modem. Every single one of those is considered a hop. When you design a network, you want to try and make sure it is 3 hops between any 2 devices that need to talk to each other. All right, looks like we're basically out to what I was calling the public internet there. So in a moment, I'll be able to show you the recommended method of doing this.
So you actually used what you're using an Etch-a-Sketch. That's what it looks like.
That's kind of what it feels like, to be
Yeah.
honest.
But it's working.
All right, so now we're seeing a modem,
Right.
and we're going to a router, and I'm going to go to a switch, which this is all the same setup as what Steven originally had. However, what we're going to do a little bit differently here is something that's called a hub and spoke design. So what that ultimately is going to lead to, as you might imagine, is something that looks a little bit like a wagon wheel. And one more thing to draw, and then I can pay attention up there. Okay, so we've got our first switch. As you can see, we're spidering out with these switches here. And what this leads to is a more efficient network. You've got one center point, and all your other switches come off that one main switch. So it leads to there being 3 hops in between any devices that are trying to talk to each other. So you cut down on packet loss, you cut down on all the frustrations of things sometimes talking to each other, sometimes not. You're going to get much faster speeds rather than a device that was all the way at the end of a 15 chain of switches. You're going to get a lot better performance out of everything on your network if it's laid out like this.
Which is imperative for using things like NDI, SRT, other IP audio infrastructures like RTMP and things like that you would use on your network.
And just to clarify for Sean here, yes, 3 hops in between any devices on the network. That is unrealistic for certain larger scale networks, but you do your best to maintain that.
Is there a size limit on a switch that you would put right after the router? Because you talk about the hub and spoke. Right now you're showing obviously 4 switches, but you talk about a larger mainframe. Could you put a 64 port switch as the one coming right off the hub and then branch that out?
Yeah, so typically you're going to find switches in 4 port, 8 port, 12 port, 16 port, 24 port, and 48 port configurations.
Okay.
Now that being said, there are switches that go over that. As an example, I guess it was originally HP and now Aruba makes like 96 port switches. And the nice thing was a lot of these higher end switches is they're blades. And by that, I mean, it's card slots. So you could have different types of ports in there if you wanted, some that were only 10/100, some that were gig, some that were POE, some that weren't. So it gives you a lot more flexibility. Now, I will admit and give the fair warning that when you reach that level of a switch, you're going to be doing a lot more work to get it set up. It is no longer just a plug and play, or even plug and play and cross your fingers. It's you're going to have a lot of work to do to get that working, set up, talking like you want it to.
Awesome. Well, I after you had told me about this and you showed me the new structure. I actually did that here in my studio, and I got rid of like 15 switches, and no lie, I had about 15 of these switches that I went back to back to back. Because again, I didn't know, and so once I did that, I was telling him like file transfers were faster, the NDI sources that I were running, the latency went way down. So there's a lot of truth to this. So I think Matt, you provided a really good overview of simplifying your network and making it work for the common man, right?
Yeah. Well, and there was one other piece, and Stephen, at some point, I think you and I are going to try and explore this for anybody doing production in particular on a network. We've shown this thing called a router. A lot of your routers
Mhm.
have ports in them. Um, a lot of your production PCs are capable of having two network cards, which means they can be joined to two different networks. So you could have one of them connected to your production network with all your cameras that's, still connected through your router, still getting internet. However, this is where you could plug your production PC directly into that modem or router at that point, bypass your local network, and now you've got a straight pipeline from your vmix system, your TriCaster, your OBS system, out to the outside world, so that whatever is going on your local network does not have a chance to impact it. You are taking priority there.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll have to do that for a future tech town hall. But Will, we're gonna send it back over to you because I know there's some other questions that you have.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. That is awesome. I think just that short bit of time honestly answered about 1,000 questions that I've had in my career here at PTC Optics. So I've got a lot of follow-up calls to make when we get done here. But before we get to that, um, no, I think that last bit about just simple things like, moving your production PC or router off your switch. It brings up a question, and I want to go back because you did talk about it real quick throughout the presentation there. But one question that I get asked all the time, because I try to explain to people the difference between an intranet and the internet. What is like a brief statement that you can talk to there? Because people can run these productions, right, in a local environment without connecting to the internet, but have an
Mhm.
intranet. So just talk to that real quick.
Yeah. So the intranet or LAN, local area network, you'll hear these terms used a lot. And ultimately, when you're talking about your LAN, I'm going to use the term LAN just because it's my comfort realm. Just know I'm talking about the same thing here. Your LAN ultimately is what is within your business. It is what is within your home. Now, with larger businesses, this might extend between separate buildings. So, your LAN can be pretty large. Uh, when you talk the internet or the public internet, you're talking about a beast that is owned by a ton of different companies running a ton of servers and a ton of routers. Um, and that's where people often say, well, you're at the mercy of the public internet. And that is because it is devices you do not own, you do not control. This is where companies like Verizon, AT&T, Google, all come into play. They are ultimately a lot of the backbone of what goes on here. So when you're talking the public internet, it's this giant beast in the background that's represented by a cloud often, because it encompasses so many different devices to make this magical information flow across the country and world. Um, but we can take the step back and say it is just like a really elaborate version of your network. So when I said that a router talks between two networks, whether it's two home networks or the public internet, it's because the public internet is really a giant version of your home LAN.
So it's basically a creek versus a pond versus an ocean, if you want to think about it in those terms.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
There you go. So in terms of like, um, I guess going back to like diagnosing your network, because one of the things that we deal with in sales all the time is people calling in and saying, "Hey, I bought your NDI PT12X camera. I love it. It looks great. I've got it plugged into my switch. I don't have an image." What when people are going to troubleshoot these things, right? Because a lot of the times, actually, I would say most, if not all the time, it's not the camera's fault. It's the network and the network setup's fault. What are some like initial places that people can look when they're having troubles with their IP infrastructure in terms of troubleshooting at home?
Yeah, so I'll touch on probably the biggest one that we hear come up, which is I bought the NDI camera, I plugged it into my network. NDI is not finding my camera. What's wrong here? Um, so when you're getting to the point where you're talking about things like NDI, and especially talking about having NDI in multiple sources, this is where the idea of a managed network comes into play. And one of the features, you don't need a super expensive network. Some very inexpensive TP-Link equipment can do this. Um, but discovery, you can't find your device. Like, that's a problem. That is a problem. It's because of something called MDNS. And it's a way that devices on your network can sit there and say, "Hey, I'm here," and somebody else can say, "Oh, I'm looking for you. Give me what you've got." Um, so if your router does not support MDNS and your switches potentially do not support MDNS, guess what? You might find products on that network, you might not, and you might find them today and you might not tomorrow. So this is where, building out the network to support the equipment you're buying can eliminate a lot of these frustrations. And we do maintain a number of guides on this, I will say, on Ubiquiti and TP-Link equipment for anyone who is interested, and the language translates to pretty much everyone. I might say Cisco equipment's a little bit of a different beast, but hopefully if you're buying that, you're going to hire a Cisco specialist.
Because no free plugs on the show here, but quick plug. I know that Netgear actually is starting to make NDI specific switches that have all these components that we're talking about. So if it seems a little daunting, all the acronyms that we've gone over, and you're on Amazon, like you said, you were looking at all the different specs, and you can't really find or really truly understand what's out there. There are companies like Netgear who are addressing this, and the infrastructure pieces to say, hey, we got everything that you need in order to support these pieces. So keep a lookout for that. Which actually brings up one question as well that we had talked about in sales. So if you want to think about like the progression of technology, web development became so easily recently with like WYSIWYG builders and Wix and all these, pieces of the puzzle that you can just build a website with, click of a button, stuff like that. Is there anything out there that you're seeing that's effectively quote unquote like automating network setup at all, or is that just a little bit distant into the future?
I could easily respond to that and say what we have today is that. If you ever tried to set up a network 10 years ago, 20 years ago, um, you needed to do a lot of planning and a lot of tuning, and then you deploy it and do more of the same. Um, Anymore, you've got that. This is where I was mentioning now. You buy a router, you're not sitting there command line interfacing with it unless you choose to do so. Most of the time now they've got this really pretty web interface that makes it really easy with all these little help bubbles that tell you exactly what the features are going to do. Um, so I would honestly say that at this point we are I it can definitely get better. But we are already in a state where it is so much better than it used to be. Um, that I have no fears that walking through somebody setting up a network remotely, even if it was my parents, I think I could probably support something like that. Whereas if this was 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I don't think that would have even been a possibility.
And Matt,
Perfect.
honestly, like I have the Google, and I thought the Google Wi-Fi setup. Now mine's kind of basic. Was the easiest to do. I mean, to do a Nest, a mesh network, like you said with the
Yeah.
command lines. Now you just plug them in and it does everything, as Will said, automated. It does everything for you.
Yep. Yeah, it really has gotten, and it's only going to get better and better. And I think seeing companies like Netgear begin to offer relatively affordable solutions that really target this market is our sign that we're just going to see more and more ease coming to our production environments, at least as we all are being forced to transition, and I ultimately believe it's for the better, to IP-centric workflows.
You were afraid of IP infrastructure in the past, maybe revisit it. There might be some new tools that you haven't discovered in
Yes.
terms of automation.
Yeah, definitely. And again,
Um,
you can't break it. Don't be afraid. Go ahead, try, because guess what? They've all got these beautiful reset buttons on the back of them. If you make an absolute mess, you can easily start from ground zero again. It's no problem.
we see a lot of shortages in the supply chain for various pieces of the puzzle. One that came up recently was USB extenders. Um, and I know that we actually have a solution here at PTZ Optics to potentially go around that using some of these different workflows leaning towards IP. Speak to that a little bit. What are some common workflows that we think we can start to replace?
I'll admit, well, it was funny because you mentioned this to me the other day, and I was over here sitting at my desk and I just started laughing because a couple years ago we kind of started talking about this as a, well, this could be a thing. Like, people might have interest in this idea of kind of getting around USB extension. But never really had an avenue to offer this to people. So yay, thank you for opening up this door to talk about it. So with the introduction of NDI onto the PTZ optics and HuddleCam cameras, um, there became a really neat opportunity where you could now essentially have an equivalent to a USB extended camera, except for it now had a limitation of like 328 feet. And it really didn't require too much other than an NDI enabled product. So for me to describe this, I'll use the example of, actually, I'll just use an NDI camera. So like our HC EPTZ-NDI, it's a little NDI webcam with EPTZ functionality, as the name suggests. So what you can do with this product, you can plug it into an outlet for power. You can then connect a network cable up to 328 feet in between a PC and that camera. And then you can launch something called NDI webcam. And magically now that NDI camera, not having to go through a network, going 328 feet, is being pulled in just like a webcam and able to be used in any webcam-based software like Zoom, Teams, VC. The list goes kind of on and on and on. Now, alternatively, our products are POE enabled. So you might not want to throw a switch in there right off the bat, but there's these wonderful things called POE injectors, and they are very affordable. Now, this is where I would again mention the PTZoptics products only require POE, not POE plus. So you do not need a POE plus injector. So in this instance, you would have your NDI camera, you would have a network cable going out of it into a POE injector that could be near the camera. It could be near the PC. I'd mention it's probably best near the PC as you already have power over there. But that being said, you would then connect another network cable out of that POE injector and into a network card on your PC, your laptop. And again, you launch the NDI webcam software, and now you can pull it in and treat it just like any other webcam. Now, both of these options have a limitation of, around 328 feet. What if you needed to go over that? Well, there is an option there, and that is your NDI camera goes into a network switch that's part of your LAN, and now your PC on that same LAN is connected via a network cable, and you run the NDI webcam software, and again, now you've got that camera showing up just like an attached USB camera. But now the distance limitation becomes the limitation of your network. It's no longer a cable limit. It is literally the limit of your network. Yeah, I mean, those are probably some of the best workflows to solve USB extension in a really, really easy fashion. Again, it's not exactly USB extension, but it is going to be offering you that same type of functionality. Now, yeah, was there a question? Nope.
We do
All
have a
right.
question that's kind of close to this topic, or do you want to finish up your thought there because this kind of speaks similarly to that?
Yeah, I mean, I can go over the one other option on. So at this point we've talked about an NDI camera and how you can leverage NDI with it to use it like a webcam. Um, However, there's also the need sometimes to take a USB camera and turn it into NDI so you can treat it the same way. So
Mm.
if you were trying to do something like that, that is where I would recommend looking at something like an Intel compute stick. Or there's also a very affordable brand of PCs on Amazon called Melee or Melee. Um, so for about $250, you get a little Windows PC that you can install the NDI tools on. One of the wonderful NDI tools is something called screen capture. That allows you to take a USB camera that would be connected to that that little PC and turn it into an NDI feed. So now you could treat it just like an NDI camera at that point. So again, same idea. It could be directly connected to another PC. It could be attached to your network. The one thing I will voice as caution here, even though in theory a lot of these things open up doors to introduce wireless, um, unless the wireless system has been tuned to handle video, I would not recommend using wireless yet on a lot of these devices. I'm hoping in the next few years we'll see that kind of change, but we're not quite there yet.
So not wireless yet, but there are some workarounds for different workflows, using IP infrastructure
Mhm.
for maybe a traditional U I think the thing about USB is it's so approachable in the sense of plug and play, right? Everyone's so used to USB, there wasn't the big complications that IP infrastructures had in the past, so it's a little bit more approachable. But if you have, say, a project that you're working on or a client that you're working with who has a project and they're talking about USB, but they have those limitations in terms of distance, you know, there are solutions and workarounds, right? Using these we'll call it network solutions. So real quick, Iman had a question actually. So just for like a general audience, can we address IP video stream, PoE, and control over IP, one cable in, one cable out? And simply compare it to USB. I think what we were talking about before actually, we had a sales meeting and we were curious when you go the route that we just spoke about, because UVC control is something that is provided for USB connection. Is there a way to interact similarly that way in terms of garnishing control, PoE, and all of that when you're talking about the workflow that you just talked
Yeah.
about?
Yeah, so one of the things that gets lost in the above, regardless of it being an NDI camera or a USB camera that is leveraging NDI, you do lose UVC control capabilities. Now, that being said, if you have an NDI camera and you're doing it the way the first three options we noted there, um, it's now an IP device. So you could download one of the free PTZoptics control solutions that is software based. And guess what? You can still control that device to your heart's content, and you don't need UVC control solutions that tend to be very limited with limited presets, with very robotic movement. You can start to leverage much higher quality, what would be almost broadcast style of movements and capabilities, even though you're doing a video call over Zoom. And the beauty there winds up becoming it makes you look really good when that happens. So there are some benefits that come to something like that.
Oh, oftentimes just adding a little piece of the puzzle, it may not be so easy as just plug and play. You do kind of create an elevated level of production value, we'll call that, which is kind of important these days. I think everyone's gotten a little Zoom fatigue. So if you see something that's like ever so slightly produced better, it becomes new, fresh, and engaging again, because we've all been on choppy and kind of horribly out of focus Zoom calls for 2 years. So anything to improve upon that, we will take. That is 100% welcome in our space. Real quick, I just have one question, because I know the acronym world gets very, very heavy when we are in this space of network infrastructure. Going back to PoE, PoE plus, PoE plus plus, and I guess plus 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 is coming, and eventually plus 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 plus, x squared or cubed, wherever they land. For that, is it down compatible? So all PTZoptics cameras have PoE. Can you use a PoE plus switch with a PTZoptics camera?
Most definitely. The only time where you have to be concerned is if somebody says the term passive PoE. And the reason is passive PoE does not negotiate sending power. So, the beauty with PoE and part of its standard is unless the device on the other end of that switcher injector says, hey, give me this power, it's not going to send anything. If you have a passive PoE setup, no matter what you plug in, that power is going down those lines, which can damage equipment. So the only thing anyone needs to be concerned about, all of it's backwards compatible. Only be concerned if somebody uses the words passive PoE. And then you need to do a little bit of homework to make sure that your PoE and the PoE it's sending match each other.
Very basic rule of thumb there. Again, it comes down to just evaluating all those little specs on your switch to make sure that things are going to talk to one another. But yeah, I think there, like we said, though, there are products that are coming out from various other manufacturers that pretty much solve for a lot of this problem. It just makes it very easy and approachable. You don't have to go through the whole spec sheet. It is, so Netgear example, it's an NDI specific or targeted switch. So those do exist. One more question here. Also, can we address that many of our competitors, etc., have PoE plus, PoE plus plus cameras, and address the cost of those switches? So I guess in terms of what we manufacture versus some of our competitors that do have PoE plus and PoE plus plus cameras, what's the advantage, disadvantage, cost, benefit analysis there?
Well, a PoE plus switch, again, it's becoming a little bit more commonplace. And as a result, you might start to see in the future a handful of PTZoptics products with PoE plus. But the beauty is, at least as of today, everything is PoE. The beauty there is, A, you're using less power. Yay, always good to be a little green if you can. But at the same time, it's less expensive. You look at the cost of, well, a PoE plus to a PoE switch might be somewhat similar at this point. But a PoE plus plus switch, that is going to start costing you some serious money. And as you start stepping up into the PoE plus 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 and such, it can get to be $1,200 for an 8-port switch versus $50 for an 8-port switch. So the costs associated with the deployment of this can grow very quickly. And to that point, we do see that most of our competitors are PoE plus, if not PoE plus plus. But yeah, we have done quite a bit of work to make sure that we can operate on that lower power option of PoE, and allowing you to work on, with PoE plus plus switches doesn't really matter at that point.
It's almost like I know that people get caught up sometimes where they're like, "Oh, but it says plus and plus plus. It must be plus plus better." And I guess in some regards, it is more helpful for depending on the type of devices that you're going to run off of that. But when it comes to our cameras, necessarily, it's not a plus plus, right? It depends on what you're running, and
Yeah.
the cost is
Well,
a perfect example of
and the
something
one
to be
thing
conscious about.
there's a big thing to learn about the tech industry that you just cited. Don't go buying the best of the best unless you know you need it for what you're doing, because the reality is, guess what? When you do need that a year later and you have now bought a product a year prior, it is going to be without features that the newer products have. It will likely also be at an elevated cost with less features. So I highly recommend do not just go buy the best of the best because you think you're building for a future there. It is often best to just buy what you need and to wait until you need that higher end solution, because you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck at that point.
So you're saying that a family of 4 shouldn't buy an F1 car, though it's faster, not the
Nah,
storage room.
probably not a good idea.
I'd love an F1 car, but they're not street legal, so no point in buying one. That's like the same thing. We talk about 4K and 8K, right? Like public internet, going back to the public internet, that big ocean of information can't even support 4K and live streams really, unless you're sitting next to the CenturyLink building and you have direct fiber optic cable straight to your like house. But outside of that, not very likely going to happen. So with that though, I think we've kind of got a nice basis. We did just cover the POE question with our competitors, so you can see it up there. But yeah, that's a great basis in terms of just talking about network infrastructure, how it works in Pro AV, UC spaces, as well as live streaming and broadcast. And these are all applicable and they're mixing and mingling. We were just talking before the show here how we're starting to see, people that traditionally operate on IP infrastructure that use security cameras for monitoring or other sorts are starting to adopt NDI technologies and PTZoptics cameras to do the things that they need to get done because they do need that higher resolution imagery that we offer, as well as the ability to pan, tilt, zoom, and monitor. And so these worlds are starting to meld together. And it's funny because, years ago, Pro AV was very distant from certain things. And now it's kind of all mixing and mingling, which is kind of cool to see. And then we're taking technologies from other industries and vice versa. So thank you again, Matt and Steven, for joining us and walking us through those topics. They are immensely complex if you want them to be, but we only just scratched the surface. At least, hopefully, we made it more digestible for you if you're in the Pro AV, broadcast, or live streaming space. Now, again, you can always follow up with us. Reach out to partners at ptzoptics.com or partners at huddlecamhd.com, whichever brand you're interacting with. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification button for this channel. What that does is that keeps you in the loop with all the topics that we talk about month to month here on the Tech Town Hall. Now, we are actively in the chats right now if you're watching the premiere. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it in. We'll get to you there. And then if you have anything that comes up later in your exploration of IP networks, NDI, video production, or just videos in general, by all means, reach out to us. We are here to help. I am William Goldie, again, signing off and thanking you for coming out to the Tech Town Hall here with PTZ Optics and HuddleCam HD.